Greetings and salutations to our fine podcast audience. Welcome to 3 Peas in a Pod, episode 241.
We made it.
We made it. We're on the same day as when we recorded last week. And if you remember, our loyal listeners, we were closely monitoring the Braves hopefully run into the playoffs. And we just got an update from producer Charlie. They're up 2-0.
In the first third of the game.
That's right. So we're things are trending in the right direction. By the time this podcast dropped, they could have gotten into the playoffs and already gotten knocked out.
Or
they
could be approaching World Series.
Maybe. Wouldn't that be great?
You just never know.
That's right. Of all years.
We just never know.
It's been a rough year.
Well, the year that we won was of all years.
It was a rough year.
It's like this year.
That's right. Which goes to show you, do we really know how to predict baseball?
We know how to predict who will be the best team over the long season. You know how you do that? They have the best record. Those are the best teams. When you play for 9 months, the team with the best record is the best team at the end of that time.
But at the same time, there's this whole industry that's grown up around sports.
That's playoff.
Well, we're going to tell you what's going to happen before it happens.
Oh, yeah.
And nobody ever goes back and analyzes that stuff and goes, okay, did they know what they were talking about, or that they were just trying to? No, they don't.
People talking. We don't want to have silence, so we listen to them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's like the in-season NBA tournament. Did the team that won the in-season tournament last year win the NBA championship? Mm-hmm. They did not, did they? I don't think so.
No, it was the Lakers.
Yeah, it's just a chance.
Won the in-season.
It's a chance to
they didn't make it
get a lot of money focused on a little thing for a short time and a bunch of fans and a bunch of cities to celebrate. Mm-hmm. That's why we now have longer playoffs in every sport, not because we want the best team. We want more money. More money.
Yes.
We want to be entertained.
That's right.
I'd hate to have to.
Entertain me. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Bring out the gladiators.
Speaking of entertainment, I hope today's conversation is entertaining.
Oh.
This is what happens when you don't send us questions.
Yeah, we had to get one more in the can.
We make something up.
So we decided
There's something we're interested in.
Yeah, for today's podcast, we even said we're going to hit record on the camera and we're just going to see what happens.
Talk about what we were interested in with there's one little factoid.
What we were interested in about 5 months ago.
That's
right.
We wrote it
down. We had one factoid, and we went from that.
All right. So, Nathan, you had looked up a statistic for us that we found interesting, that we thought would be interesting to talk about.
Well, I didn't find the exact statistic.
You didn't find it.
I didn't find it. But
you give your stat, then I'll give the quote that I gave that got us to where we're going to go.
Okay.
Yeah. So we're talking about the idea of cultural Christianity versus becoming a disciple. There's some quote, I know it's in John Mark Comer's book, Practicing the Way, that Steve Clark had mentioned in a on mission discipleship program we'd had, which was basically when you look at there was a Gallup poll, I believe it was, that asked basically, do you identify as a Christian or not? And that was some high percentage. It was
in the United States.
Yeah, in the United States was 70, 80, whatever that percentage is in the United States that identify as Christian. But of that percentage, I believe the number was 4%, would be able to have any of the practicing behaviors of a disciple. Things like regularly reading their Bible, engaged in prayer habits, attending church on a regular basis, giving to the poor, those kind of things. When they did those deeper questions, only 4% of those people actually got to a place where they would actually be what Jesus would probably refer to as his disciple. And so there's this wide margin between people who would claim to be Christian and people who actually take seriously what Jesus has asked them to do. And that was one discussion we were looking at.
And so then I had gone from that to a quote I had heard from Richard Dawkins. Some of you may know Richard Dawkins is a outspoken atheist. He wrote several books in the early 2000s that became the new atheist movement, and became a very famous guy. And he has recently this year come out, he's from Great Britain, and said that he is a cultural Christian. And what he said he meant by that is he doesn't believe anything that Christianity believes, but he only wants to live in a country where Christianity is the dominant force because of the values that Christianity backs up. And so with those two things, along with the current movement in our country that a lot of people are talking about, Christian nationalism, and the movement of what people always, there's a voting block apparently of white evangelical that the news media is fascinated with, and pollsters. And there's a large percentage of what now is a voting block of white evangelicals that don't practice any of the things that evangelicals have always practiced. And they don't care about that kind of stuff, but they are the people that are pushing the 10 Commandments, which, by the way, that's an Old Testament thing. That's not a Christian. That's anyway. But anyway, so that's what we decided to talk about. How that came about. What does that have to do with the culture that we currently live in, and how those of us who are followers of Christ ought to be on guard against that kind of stuff? Maybe that's what we should talk about.
Well, let's do it.
All right. Who wants to go first?
About what? Say the question again.
I didn't really have a question.
Okay.
This is what happens when we turn the camera.
All right.
on.
Okay. Well, I think the first thing, I mean, if we want to tackle the cultural Christian or the Christian nationalism thing first, I think you have to determine what would make something a Christian nation. And by and large, I think what I at least hear from, I'll say, younger people who I know are in the Christian nationalist movement. I'll see people on TikTok, and it interests me to hear what, I don't agree with them, but I like to listen to other people's thoughts on things. And so when I see it, most of it seems to be around, there's this phrase Judeo-Christian, which isn't a thing. I don't know fully what that means. I think what they mean is the Bible
has its roots in the Bible.
Has its roots in the Bible, but even that I don't think is authentic to what is true.
Selective parts of the Bible.
I would say it's their interpretation of what
the
Bible says.
I would say the difficult part for that, so the idea of a Christian nation, is most of it comes down to, is centered around a belief in God, a certain set of morality that is kind of centered around that. But well, I don't want to say historically, the earliest Christians would not have identified Christianity primarily based around a certain set of beliefs, but a certain way of life that is formed out of a certain set of beliefs. In fact, the arguments that people bring in against Christianity of, the Nicene Council and all these different things, they're the ones who formed the belief. Well, they're the ones who kind of codified things, but the reason they codified them was because no one even cared about it until that point. There's a book that I love called The Patient Ferment of the Early Church.
Ding!
And when they talk about that, the whole point of that book is, until Constantine, Constantine really is one of the first people who says, hey, we should make this about what you believe, not what you do.
Well, because he was trying to make a Christian nation.
He was trying, when you're trying to form and basically say everyone has to be Christian, I just need to know, do you believe the right things, not if you do the right things. In the first 300 years of the church, it was pretty clear you couldn't come take communion if you hadn't visited a widow or gone to a prison and fed somebody, or taking care of someone who was poor. They'd say, you can't even come take communion because I don't care what you believe. You didn't do any of the stuff. And then that all changes to when they go, well, we got to have the right thoughts about things and the right beliefs around things, because that's an easier thing to manage than are you actually going to do what it is. So
I'm sitting here thinking as well, Nathan, when you brought up that kind of stuff about you couldn't take communion, similar things are taking place nowadays in countries where they're predominantly Islamic nationalist kind of governments, and Christianity is growing like crazy in those countries. But because it's so dangerous to be a Christian, and they're so aware that Islamic terrorists could want to infiltrate and find out who all the Christians are and kill them, one of the very first things you have to do when you say you want to be a Christian is get baptized, do it publicly, and you must go and tell everyone you know that you just said no to Allah and yes to Jesus, at which point they're probably going to threaten to kill you.
Right.
You have to do something that says, I'm fully in. I didn't just believe something.
Right. And so when I hear people talk about, whether it's America or not, but everyone I hear is talking about America being a Christian nation, what I hear most people talk about is, well, our founding documents are kind of based on this worldview, or our laws are kind of based around this certain set of morality. But Christian morality is not a set of doctrines or ideas that we hold on to. It really is a life that is formed out of the truth that Jesus died on the cross and rose again. And if that's true, how then should we live? Based on what he taught and how he lived, if he really did die on the cross and rise again, how should you live? And so when you see Paul reference things, or Peter reference things, or James, they're frequently saying, do this as Christ did for you. Forgive as Christ has forgiven you. Submit to one another in this, out of reverence for Christ. Everything is this reference back to a story. So even though it's true, there are principles in the teaching of Jesus that anyone can take and apply to their lives, and they'd be good things to apply to your life, they don't really fully make sense apart from the story of Jesus's life. And so taking those concepts and saying, well, everyone should just live them because that's a good moral way. Well, it's only a good moral way if I really believe he died on the cross and rose again. Because forgiving someone who has wronged me, if I don't believe that that's the way the universe now operates based on the kingdom of God that is present, not only sounds foolish, it could be taken to dangerous extremes.
Yes.
Of course.
It can be without rooted in the story of a God who died for sin, therefore sin must also be dealt with. All of that is forgiveness is rooted in all of that. And so when you talk about a Christian nation, I don't know how you build an economy based on Jesus's teachings of sell your possessions and give them to the poor. I mean in a legitimate way. I don't know how you get a functioning empire built on that. I don't know how you build a national defense around turn the other cheek and don't return evil for evil and don't resist an evil person. I don't know how you build a national defense against those kind of things.
Well, we may have to accept the fact that nobody really wants to talk about is that nations and empires may in fact not be the work of the Spirit.
Amen.
Well, that's yes.
That's the natural conclusion, and that maybe when Jesus came and fulfilled all the law and prophets, which people don't want to even talk about the holy nation of Israel, maybe even that nation.
That's right.
Because Peter says now, the church, we are holy. All the things applied to Israel,
Yes.
he now applies to us. And so maybe we shouldn't be concerned about empires and nations and borders because I don't think God is.
And I think that's when you when you look at that from a Christian nationalism, Christian nation point of view, that's more of a conceptual, philosophical kind of thought of, I just was recently reading the idea even of nation states, the way we think of them, is a 16th century idea. No one really thought of nation states before because it was all just a king. It was a guy. There was no structure for the nation state. It was this guy and his family, and everyone else was just kind of subservient and paid taxes. The idea that you would give your life for this greater cause of your nation state. If that king and his family got wiped out, you just go to the next king and whatever their thing was, because there wasn't this idea. So that's the bigger conceptual idea. I think when you get to the smaller thing where people get to in politics, and maybe this is the cultural Christianity thing, is, well, then how do I take care of my neighbors? How then do I...
Or do I have a responsibility?
Or do I have a responsibility, right? But I think certainly most Christians... cultural or not, you're aware of the teaching of Jesus to love your neighbor as yourself. Even most, and I would say this, even most of I would say nearly all the Christian nationalists that I hear that would say, hey, the Christian should be in charge of the government, they would also say, so that we can love our neighbors the way that God has told us to. It is so that this is the way to love your neighbor. They don't want to, because if you know the Bible, Jesus is pretty clear. Love God and love your neighbor, that's the deal. The question then becomes, what is the way that we actually do love our neighbors based on Jesus's way? Is the best way to do that through political power and through enforcing certain policies?
But I'm with you though. I mean, how does that work itself out when the only kind of power that Jesus ever left us with was a power that comes underneath
Sure.
rather than a power that goes over.
It serves my neighbor.
Yeah,
It doesn't
Sure.
decide what's best for my neighbor.
that's right.
Sure.
So, I mean, I think what you said earlier is true. How can that ethic be applied in a national kind of situation or a
Sure.
nation kind
It can't be enforced. It just can't be enforced. It must be encouraged. So when you start talking about nations and politics and those kind of things, even cultural values like Richard Dawkins did, I want to live where these are the cultural values. Well, Richard Dawkins needs to start living out those values,
Mm-hmm.
influencing everybody he can to live those values. And maybe over time that will become, you cannot, by saying, I am going to enforce that everybody has to love their neighbor. I just didn't love any of my neighbors by forcing
By
them to
forcing
love
them.
their neighbors.
Yeah.
Well, and you can't.
I can't make you do this thing
Well,
and live it out.
Yeah.
and love is a thing that I can't force you to have.
That's what I mean. Yeah.
And
I can demonstrate it. I can live it. I can offer it.
yeah,
But I cannot make anyone do it.
yeah. I think that's the harder struggle when you look at. So I think we're saying the same thing on that. I think then the next level, when you get to cultural Christianity versus disciples, what does it mean to be a cultural Christian? If you take the nationalism part away from it,
Mhm.
what does it mean to be a cultural Christian versus this 4% thing that we were talking about?
Well, the truth is, it would come down the same way. It would get into a vote of what part of the culture Christianity do I want to be a part of the culture I like.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he talks specifically, I want to celebrate Christmas.
Right.
I want to see the church bells ring. I
Yes.
want to have this feeling. I mean, he was talking about just aesthetic kind of things.
That's
that
right.
He enjoyed. People want, but most of those things he mentioned aren't even Christian.
No,
They're just trappings.
that's right.
So if you want to then go, I want to remove, I mean, you used the phrase when we were before we pressed record, you want the kingdom, you want the feeling of the kingdom, you want the trappings of the kingdom, or you want some of the blessings. I do want to help. I want us to be nice to each other. That's generally what they mean. They don't mean loving. I want to be nice.
Mhm.
I want it to be done in certain kind of ways. I want it to, all this kind of stuff.
I
It's
want
really,
peace on earth, goodwill toward men.
yeah.
Yeah.
You said, I want the kingdom without the king.
But I don't want none of Jesus' stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And even if I find out it comes from Jesus, well, that's just a byproduct. It just happens to come from Jesus.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's been part of, and maybe it's been lost or not. I think when we first started talking this year about this idea of everyone has a story that they want their lives to tell, but our job is to live into Jesus's story. A lot of those thoughts really kind of started with a Christian ethicist named Stanley Hauerwas, and this is kind of his framework for all of these things, in that he says that most of us have this idea that what Jesus came to do was to help me get the story that I would have chosen to be my story. And that his point is ultimately all of our morality as Christians, all of our ethics as Christians only exist within the context of the story of Jesus. Therefore, we have to live it out. But that's a story everyone has to adopt for themselves, every person who wants to be a part of it. So when you even talk about, making someone love their neighbor, I'm not making them love their neighbor. I'm making them do something for their neighbor. And there's this weird part of love where everything is a pendulum and we want to swing it one way.
It's an HOA.
Sure.
You can only plant Bermuda because he's going to have Bermuda, and we don't want y'all getting your grass over on each other's side.
Yeah.
So you may not want Bermuda. We're all doing Bermuda, dang it.
That's right.
And we're also going to have oak trees that kill Bermuda.
And so we swing a pendulum one way or the other, where some people think of love as purely sentimental and it's affection that I have for someone. And then other people swing and goes, no, love is a verb, it's an action, it's a thing that you do for other people. But the way the Bible seems to is love is something that you become, because God is love. Therefore, we are formed into the person of love. So there are things that I do that are loving. And there are feelings that I feel that are loving. But it all comes from God. And so the way to enter into a loving relationship with other people is to put Jesus at the center. Everything else, and this is the difficult part, even And Jesus would even say this about parents where, he'll say things about, this is how you treat God, but you parents who are evil.
Yeah,
He doesn't
right.
say, you know how much you love your kids. He says, you know how you're evil, but even you who are evil with your kids wouldn't do something this evil. We tend to think you don't know love until you've had a kid. Well, that's not necessarily true either. Something that feels very close to love, which is there still though is a ton of mutual self-interest between me and my kid, and you don't start to realize it until they're old enough to push back. And you suddenly realize this kid is their own person and they don't think the way that I think. My kid, my oldest right now is just about to turn 13. She's finally reached that stage, and no matter what I say, that's the dumbest thing. I don't even know if she disagrees with half the stuff I said, but she gotta just.
That ain't what I came up with.
Yes, exactly.
I reject it.
I just got to push against it a little bit. And I feel that thing. And I said to my wife, you remember when I was the smartest person in the world? And you start to get this feeling of, do I actually love her enough to allow her to have different thoughts than I have? Or do I feel the need of going, we need to argue about all these things. You need to see my point of view so you can come to my side of this thing. Love allows the person to be separate from me. So what that must mean in any relationship, in order for me to have that kind of love for my neighbors, that has to come from something that's not me. That allows me to say, allowing you to be different than me may mean that you want to harm me. May mean that you, in fact, want to be my enemy, and now I have to love you as an enemy. May, in fact, mean that you want to curse me, so I'm going to have to bless you. But see, that's difficult if it's not centered in a story where even if you do kill me, my life's eternally secure.
Yeah, I have said to people for years who come and want to talk about forgiveness, which is a struggle for most of us if you've ever been hurt, which everybody's been hurt.
That's right.
If you don't buy into the only reason for you to ever forgive is that Jesus forgave you, you can talk yourself out of it.
Of course.
If you don't get down to, because it doesn't make total sense in some cases. And so you just talk yourself out of it, unless the command is forgive just as I forgave you. And the truth of the gospel is I was forgiven before I knew Jesus. Before while I was still a sinner. Christ died for me. The act that forgave me from God's end of the bridge, if we use that illustration, it was wide open the whole time.
Yes, right.
And so that's where I have to get, is that I don't hold that against you anymore. That's not easy. And sometimes it feels impossible. And without the work of the Spirit and the story of Jesus at work in your life, you're never going to get there.
And to wrap this back around to where you originally started, I don't hear that is in any way a part of the quote unquote cultural Christianity that people want in our society.
No.
That part is not ever a part of the conversation.
Most of what I hear as part of the cultural Christianity sounds a lot more like 1950s morality.
That's right.
And for anybody that now, from the distance of 80 years, looks back at the 1950s and goes, man, those were some really moral people. Y'all need to read more.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but even that, and you talk about the forgiveness thing. I mean, I don't hear that in the cultural.
Oh, forgiveness? Oh, gosh. Forgiveness is not a value.
I hear the eye for eye, tooth for tooth part.
Well, and I hear
which is Old Testament before Jesus.
I hear the rationale of the reason you forgive is because you can't rent space to people in your head.
Well, yeah, because it's good for you.
It's good for you. I'm doing it for
and
self.
that'll get you so far.
It won't get you completely to forgiveness, has been my experience.
Well, and what it may get you to, and I wonder this about even that part where you're talking about of people. So I don't believe everything Jesus does, and I do believe that people who don't believe Jesus still love people, still experience it. But I think we experience it in part, and I don't think it comes from you even when you're doing it. I think what happens is, I do believe there are principles, moral principles that Jesus set up for things, but not in the post-enlightenment way we think of it, of like God set up a watch and the universe is this watch that he set and it's just ticking along. And as long as you're working within those laws of the clock, everything still works. I think it is that God is behind every act of love, every act of charity, every act of forgiveness. And that when you do forgive somebody, the reason that there is some kind of power that gets released in you is you're actually interacting with God, whether you know it or
I
not.
think that's true.
You are aligning yourself with him and you're experiencing the peace that comes from you're experiencing these things. The difficult part is
It's the helper's high. When you do some kind of act of charity,
Yeah.
when you go and give to the poor, whether you think you ought to or you're
Yes.
supposed to or you just want to, there is a joy that comes from
And
it.
it's why in every culture, there is something, not lots of things maybe, but there are certain values and certain ideas. Every missionary knows this when they go to a culture. There are some values of every culture. I just have to call out and say that is not a God. But the first thing I do is come in and find the things in your culture that do look like the kingdom.
That's right.
And say, hey, this thing you have, this Christian idea this American idea we have, that really people, because both political parties are this. They just have identified the little guy as someone different. If you're on the right, it might be the little guy is the small business owner who's trying to get their thing together and the government's doing whatever. And this side, it's, well, someone who's been oppressed on this, whatever it is. But even that idea of the little guy, someone should protect them, that is not inherent to the world because before the Enlightenment, before Christianity, that doesn't come about. So we look at them and go, hey, that's a great thing. That's a great thing. You have this heart. Let me show you the full picture you don't see that is Jesus behind this, right? And then there certainly are aspects that aren't. But that comes because when I do that, I'm interacting with Jesus. But I think the bigger part that we have to get to for people when it comes to cultural Christianity is you'll never get to the full picture of it until you eventually say, Jesus is king. This is his story that he is inviting you into. He is inviting you into a story that the way things work, forgiveness is just the way that the kingdom operates. It's the way the world was meant to operate. Is that people, I have to say this to my girls, because my girls are, kids are just more honest than everyone else is. But one of my girls said the other day where she had tried to extend some grace to one of her younger sisters. And she said, hey, you can come to my room and you can play with. She got kicked out. She had violated the rules and she got kicked. So she said, you keep telling me Jesus would keep including people, so I'm going to let her come in. Well, then that sister was incredibly careless and ripped up her favorite picture, favorite thing she'd worked on. And she said, she came to me afterwards. She just said, I really want to hurt her. She really hurt me and she doesn't care. And I feel like if I don't hurt her back, that she'll just keep doing it. And this is what she ultimately said. She goes, it feels like what she did to me doesn't matter if I don't do something better.
That's right.
And so I said, here is the issue. I said, I get it. I feel everything you feel. And honestly, I ain't going to do anything no matter what you determine to do. I said, whatever you determine to do, minus killing her, I ain't even going to get involved. Here's what I want you to think about. You stood in the baptistry. You said, I want Jesus to forgive my sins because I want to live in a world where people don't get what they deserve. You have to determine at some point, do you actually want to live in that world or do you just want to get away with the bad things you did? Because wanting to live in a world where people don't get what they deserve, and that's the story that Jesus is painting, is because Jesus has risen from the dead, that world is the only actual world. That world is here, and it is coming in fullness, and that world eventually will destroy the other worlds, and it will be the only world that's left. But there is a way currently right now to live in that world, not this world.
That's right.
And then they go, but that doesn't make sense. And I said, why? Because they're just getting older. And they said, so what you're saying is I should forgive people, and that if they decide they want to come and kill me, then they can kill me. And I said, well, what's the other option? They said, well, if they hit me, because they were talking about, what if someone punches you? And I said, well, you can defend yourself and get away and do that. I said, but your goal is not to hurt them so bad. They go, but I got to make sure they know if they come back, it's going to be worse for them. And I said, so what's the worst thing that can happen? Well, they come back and they kill me. And I said, I get that. And that's the worst thing. They said, well, that'll be everything. And then one of my daughters said, well, it's not everything because then you go be with Jesus.
It's not everything. Yep.
Well, that kind of worldview is only possible
Because of the story of Jesus.
That's right.
because
Jesus
of the
makes that
story I
possible.
live in. If I don't live in that story, and I really mean this, my non-believing neighbors, I get why they're all about politics. And this is the end all be all of everything, because in their worldview, and that's why I say when people say nothing's going to change, no, we have seen countries where world leaders get in power and things really go bad. There could be bad things coming.
Mhm.
I'm not saying that that's not necessarily true.
Mhm.
What I'm saying is that does not affect the kingdom that I live in.
Yes.
That does not affect there are real people whose real lives are going to be affected. And my job is to come alongside them with the amount of blessing I can have to love and bless them and maybe defend them. And maybe if one thing that I have to help them is the vote I've been given. And so I want to use my voice and say, hey, I'm going to throw myself in with people I think will help my neighbors. I think that is perfectly legitimate. I think that is perfectly an acceptable way for Christians to get involved. I just don't get why Christians would believe if this person comes to power and it does go horrible and our lives are threatened, that somehow that's the end of the work that Jesus is doing in the world. That does not seem to be the story that I bought into.
That's right.
Yes.
That's it.
So we got 30 minutes of that.
Mm-hmm.
There we go.
And so that's enough time. And this room is getting a little hot.
I agree.
It is.
It's a little
It's a little
stuffy.
stuffy.
So we're going to, what's the score, Charlie?
3-0 Braves.
3-0 Braves.
What
Still
inning?
going.
What inning?
Bottom of 6th.
Bottom of the sixth.
All right, we're through the
We
second third.
may be making it into the playoffs. Yay. So we will continue on that track. Send us more questions and you won't get 30 minutes of that rambling.
ranting.
No.
But we just did it. So maybe they want
Oh,
more
we
of
have
that.
we have a ranting.
We can do some more ranting.
We got ranting.
We got
about it.
other topics we could go on. So you make the choice. So we'll see you next week. Bye.